What is going on, you guys, and welcome to the channel. In this series, we're going to be looking at the Django Rest Framework, which is a very popular Python library for developing RESTful APIs using the Django framework. Now, personally, I use this every day in my professional career for the company I work at, and I've really come to love it. And I see its use cases and how popular it is in other companies. And so, it's a beginner's introduction, if you like, to Django Rest Framework. We're going to be covering topics such as creating a custom user model, which is what this video is going to be about, along with, just building the API up from registering to authenticating a user, and also implementing the standard CRUD operations, creating, reading, updating, and deleting objects, along with permissions. So for example, if you want an authenticated user to be able to create something, we'll be looking at that. And also something not related to Django Rest Framework, we'll also use Python data classes, which is a very popular concept now, especially when building Python applications, as it makes it very quick and easy for you to create a class without having to handle the typical things that you usually do when building a class, such as the initializer, etc. And we'll incorporate that with our serializers. So in that sense, it will be a kind of different perspective of how to build serializers using the Django Rest Framework. So in this video, we're solely focusing on building a custom user model in Django. So to get started, the first thing is to open up a new directory. I've called this one DRF API, so Django Rest Framework API. And let's go ahead and create our virtual environment. So I'm going to do Python 3-m venv and venv. Give that a second. And now you'll have this venv. Ignore the licenses readme. This is just part of the GitHub repo. Next, I'm going to just activate it. So source venv and then bin and then activate. And you should see this here, just prefixed on the line. Okay, next we need to make the necessary installations. So first of all, type in pip. I'm using pip. You can use whatever installer you want. I'm going to say install Django pyjwt, which will be used for JWT authentication, and you'll see that later on. And then Django Rest Framework itself, and make sure you spell it all in one word. So Django Rest Framework, then Django-cause-headers. Now this is for if you have a front-end application that will communicate with your back-end Django Rest Framework app, then you'll want this as well. And then finally black, and that's just to format the code in a nice way. This one here, it's not necessary. I just usually have this in place to kind of ensure that it's readable and it's consistent when it comes to the code, the way the code looks. Now just give this a second and we should have everything installed. So once you've installed everything, the next thing you want to do is start your Django project. So to do that, Django-admin start project, and then call it whatever you want. I'm just going to call this API, hit enter. And now if you list out, you'll have this API, or the folder or the name of the project that you specified. Now go ahead and open up your favorite IDE or text editor. I'm going to go ahead and use PyCharm, as I find it a lot easier now to develop with that. So once you've opened up your text editor, if you're using PyCharm, then one thing I recommend doing is on the API directory, if you've named it that, then just right click it and go into mark directory and click on mark as sources root. Mine already is marked as that, but you should see, instead of where it says for me unmark as sources root, you should see a mark as sources root. Just click on that, and that will just make it easier for the text editor to recognize your imports and exports without it complaining. But that's for PyCharm. Now, before we actually jump into the actual coding part, what I like doing when starting a Django project is to rename this subdirectory API. So within API, there's another directory called API. I want to rename this to core. So that just tells me that anything that I name core is going to be the is where the settings.py file lives and all that. So I'm just going to right click it and click on refactor, rename, and then change this to core. And then find all instances where it used to say where it says API and change that to core. So I'm just going to do Command Shift F and API, type in API here, and go through the ones where it says it. So a lot of these are comments, so that doesn't really matter, but in the actual code, change some of these things. And then here, core, we also have it here, core as well. And that should be, I think the rest are comments. But now if we go over to, this one should be core. Did it save it? Yeah, save that one. Still API. Check. And yeah, we can just do a quick test run for this, see if it complains. So inside the terminal, go into just do an ls, you'll see API nvenv. Go into API itself, and then you Python manage run server. Yeah, you have 18 unapplied migrations. We don't want to make any migrations just yet, but as long as this is your output, you should be fine. Now I'm just going to close this and clear it. Now the next thing we want to do is create our user app inside our Django project. So I'm again inside the API directory. Now to create an app is to do Python manage.py and then start app and then call it user. Now you should see a user directory pop up, and that is what we'll use to create everything related to our user, especially our custom model. Now go into the models.py file, and what you want to do is, so we already have the import for models, and I hope you guys can see this all right. I'm just going to adjust the text size. So let's do 15 maybe. Hopefully that makes it easier to read. But yeah, so here what we want to import is the auth model, so the authentication model. So from django.contrib.auth import models, and we'll say, as we already have something called models, we'll call this auth models, like so. Now, the first thing we want to do is create our user, and this doesn't take a lot of line of code, doesn't take many lines of code. So we'll say class user, and this will inherit from auth models.user, abstract user. And from here, we can fill in what we want a user model or user object to hold. So we want the first name, which we'll set to models.charfield, and we'll give this a verbose name of just first name. It's just, I'm used to adding a verbose name when it comes to Django. You don't have to add this part, but this next part you do, which is the max length. We'll give that a length of 255. We'll have a last name, which will do models.charfield.verbose name, and then last name. Now, the first name, last name, there's some of these fields that we'll be specifying that we don't actually need to, as they're already included in abstract user. So we can actually go in there and we can see that we have a username that's there. We have first name, last name, email, all of these. And yes, we are specifying them again inside our user model. However, the reason why I'm putting it here is just for completion's sake, just to kind of see it in a more, without having to kind of abstract it away. Next, we need the email. We'll say models.email field. Now this, we'll just give it a verbose name of email. and a max length of 255. And we also want this to be unique, as we don't want two users with the same email. We want a password, which will just be a char field with a max length of 255 as well. And we want to set the username to none, because we don't want to create users with a username. Email in the real world actually is typically used more often than the username, especially with SaaS applications, etc. So we'll set username to none. And the reason why we're doing that is because inside abstract username is not set to none. It's actually a char field, and we want to get rid of the username altogether. So to actually do that, we first need to say that the username field is email, so in double quotes, and then the required fields, we'll set that as first name and last name. And what we'll do is now create our user manager. Now to do that, we need above our user class, we'll create a new one called class user manager, and this is for when creating users via the Django CLI. And like, for example, when you create a super user, which we'll see in a second. Now you want to inherit from Auth Model's base user manager. And then let's create a function called create user. So this will take in a first name, and to add some typing, we'll set that as string. We want the last name, which is also a string, email, which is a string, password, which is a string, and by default, we'll set this to none. We'll set is staff to false, and is underscore super user to false as well. So these are the default values for it. Now this will return a user, so we'll just say in quotes user. And let's go ahead and add in the validation. So we'll say if not email, so if there's no email provided, raise a value error, and we'll just say user must have an email. Next we'll say if not first name, raise value error, user must have a first name. And if not last name, raise value error, user must have a last name. So that's for the checks. Next, let's go ahead and create our object. So we'll say user equals self.model, and then we'll do email equals self.normalize email, and we'll throw in the email that we passed in through the parameter. Next, we'll say user.firstname equals first name, user.lastname equals last name, user.setPassword, and we'll just throw in password. Then user.isActive, this is true. User.isStaff, so that too is staff. So a bit of tedious setting here, but bear with me. And then user is underscore super user, and we'll set this to is super user. And then finally, we need to save the user to our database, and then we can just return it. So we can say return user. Cool, so that's creating a user, a standard user. The next is to have our create super user, and we'll say create super user. This will take in all the same things as before, so first name, last name, email, and password. And then this again will return a user. And what we'll do is say user equals self.createUser, so calling this function that we just wrote. And we'll fill all that in. So we'll say first name equals first name, last name equals last name, email equals email, password equals password. And we will say that the isStaff is set to true and isSuperUser set to true as well. And finally, we can just put user.save and return user. So that's our user manager. This is useful for when creating our super user within the CLI. Now back down on our user model, what we want to do is attach that to our user manager class. So we will just say objects equals user manager. And that's pretty much it for the models file. Now, we need our Django application to recognize this user rather than use the user that comes with Django. So what we need to do is jump into the settings.py file. And in there, we need to add first of all, our user app to installed apps. But before we do that, we also need to add REST framework. So in installed apps, put in REST framework. And then below that is where we'll have our user. So user like that. Okay, so that's not it just yet. We need to tell Django where this user model is to be used as the user. So just under here, I usually put it at the bottom of the file. I'm going to say that the auth underscore user underscore model is in the directory user, and then it's the user class, like so. So auth underscore user underscore model in capitals, and then set it to user.user. We also want to set our origins, our cause origins that we installed. So we can say cause underscore origin. And all this part here, the cause part, will come more into play as we build our API. But it's just nice to kind of have this in now. Allow all, we'll set this to true. And then cause allow underscore credentials, we'll set this to true as well. So that's our user model and as well as our cause. So what we need to do is go ahead and make our migrations. So in the command line, type in Python manage make migrations. And you'll see this create a model user. And if we go into our user directory, we'll see in the migrations that we have this 0001 initial, which is our initial creation of our user model. And then finally, we want to apply the migration along with all the other migrations that come with initializing a Django project. So Python manage and then migrate, and you should see the following output. Now, of course, we're not using any fancy database. We're just making use of the SQLite database that comes with Django. So you'll see here in your file explorer that you have a db.sqlite3. Now, we won't cover adding like a MySQL or Postgres database. That, of course, is a topic for another day, but for now, it's fine having it as SQLite 3. Okay, that's basically our user model. So let's go ahead and create our super user so to test that works. So I'm just going to clear this and type in Python manage.py create super user. Now we need to add an email. I'm just going to say admin@gmail.com. Give it a first name, call it rhythmic. Last name, admin. Password, let's give it a random password. And there you have it. You have a super user created successfully. Now to actually log this in, let's start our Django application. So Python manage run server. And if you head over to this endpoint, if I open this, and then go over to admin, we can sign in, and it's asking for your email and password. If you were to be using the typical Django user model, then you'll see username and password. However, because we're not going to be using a username, it's asking for an email. So here I'll just put admin@gmail.com and then enter the password, log in, and we don't have anything here, but we just see groups. Now, the next thing is to actually show our users, like groups is one thing, and we're not going to be using groups in this tutorial, but we also want the users there as well. So to do that, go into the user directory in our code base and open up the admin.py file. And this is where we can add in our user model so that it's recognized in our Django admin. So here, all you need to do is import the model. So from period, import models, and then say class underscore user admin. And the reason why I'm putting an underscore is so that, we're not reusing this outside of the directory. And then just say, actually, to be honest, it doesn't really matter. Let's just call it class user admin, and then say admin.model admin, and then say list underscore display equals, and say ID. We'll have the first underscore name. We'll have the last name. We'll add the email, and I'd say that's about it. You can add more columns if you want. And then finally, we'll say admin.site.register, and then throw in our models.user along with our user admin. Now, if I open up the terminal again, the service should still be running. And if I head back to the Django admin, refresh, we now have users. And if I click on it, we have only one user, and that makes sense because we only have our super user. And this just gives all the extra insight there. So we can see that it's staff status and also active, along with super user status, and yeah, all the extra information that you'd want with your user. So you can also add whatever you want to your user model. If you want to add in, I don't know, like their phone number, you could say phone underscore number, and then set that to models.charfield. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Like, you can customize even more than basically what Django gives you from the get-go. If you want to change stuff later on down the road, it makes it a lot easier than having to deal with the Django model that is shipped, the Django user model that comes that is shipped. But yeah, that's really it for creating a user model. In the next video, we're going to be looking at actually building our API and adding our authentication endpoints along with our registration endpoint. But for now, stay healthy and stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next video.